Hey everyone! When we left class, we had talked about the formation of NATO. We had talked about the division of Berlin into four sectors, with West Berlin divided between the US, Great Britain, and France, and East Berlin belonging to the Soviet Union. We talked about the Soviets blockading roads into Berlin, and then the US, Britain, and France using airplanes to drop food and supplies into the city. Eventually, in 1961, the Berlin Wall is built to divide for 30 years, East and West. Mostly, because the Soviets wanted to keep East Berliners from being able to freely move into the free and democratic West Berlin. We watched part of this Mr. Betts video in class, but I wanted to go ahead and repeat it for you because I know how much you love them and also because it's got some really great information. So make sure you pay attention.
Post-war Germany has been divided in half. The West is controlled by England, US and France. Eastern side is occupied by USSR. Iron Curtain falling down, we're in a Cold War. Containment aims to walk communism. With the Marshall Plan, but here's Stalin. Divided German capital city of Berlin. Last 100 miles of love are ruled by him. Black day, access to West Berlin will blame Stalin. Load 'em up, get the supplies in. Fly, fly, fly into West Berlin. Load 'em up, the Berlin airlift. 250,000 flights so Berliners can live. Drop food, medicine. Close, the West will win the fight. Oh, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin. Give it up like for 10 months more. Drop, 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 then we drop some more. Don't need where we all going. Catch me outside, how about that Stalin? Yeah, your blockade's done. Score 0-1 the fight. Oh, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin. By the 60s, two Germany's on different paths. West Germans are capitalists, East socialists. And every day people fled to West Berlin and crucial for somewhere to keep them all in. One night in August 61, brain drain is done. Another war between the Berlins. Can't believe Eastern citizens. Soviets and the East Germans trapping in their people like it is a prison. Hey, get off that wall. Shoot the bodies for the fight. Oh, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin. Every mile is deadly wall. Trap, 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 cause it's 12 feet tall. 30 years that the wall stood strong. Symbol of oppression of the Soviet Union. Still, some got across. No, we'll never stop the fight. Oh, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin, Cold War Berlin. As the decades pass, Cold War goes on. How long will it last? In the 80s, this is it. Trouble brewing for the Soviets. It was a perestroika. In glasnost nations fall. That once were held by Russia. Now believing the same freedom should be spread into Berlin. Gorbachev dead and his wall.
Welcome back, class. I'm Mr. Betts, and that was Cold War Berlin done to Katy Perry's Chained to the Rhythm. Berlin, one of my favorite historical cities. Hey, let me know what favorite historical city you've actually been to. And if you're not subscribed, why not? I'm going to be with you all the way to finals. Hit that subscribe button. Be safe, and I'll see you next time.
So we're going to pick up where we left off. Berlin's been divided. We're trying to reconstruct Germany, trying to prevent another world war from breaking out. In addition, we also have to figure out how to reconstruct Japan. And that is left to General Douglas MacArthur, who we've talked about before. He oversees the reconstruction in Japan. Japan is going to be a democracy. The Japanese cooperate fully with our reorganization efforts. They actually welcome modernization. MacArthur dictates the constitution that Japan will have. It is approved in 1946. It renounced militarism, provided for women's equality, and it introduced a Western-style democratic government. And those things are still around in Japan today. The opposite happens in China. China has been embroiled in a civil war for years at this point. Mao Zedong, a guy who came up on the right, is going to come in with his communist forces. They're going to sweep through the country, and in late 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist forces are forced to flee to Taiwan. So Chiang is on the left and Mao is on the right. Mao is going to institute his Cultural Revolution of China, which makes China a very repressive country, still that way in many ways today, though the economy has become more capitalistic. But this all starts under Mao at the end of the 40s. Taiwan is where Chiang flees to. There's still a lot of bitterness between Taiwan and China. Taiwan does not want to be part of China officially necessarily, but China claims Taiwan as its own. So you see these things playing out. You'll see them playing out as the US government talks about relations with China, as we talk about how we're are not going to recognize Taiwan as separate from China. So you will see events from this period that we're talking about in class carrying over into current events that we're seeing today. We're going to see more efforts with the atomic bomb. In September of 1949, the Soviets are going to figure out how to explode an atomic bomb. This happens 3 years before the US expected them to have the capability. In response, President Truman is going to order the development of the hydrogen bomb that would be 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb. Oppenheimer, who had directed the Manhattan Project, he is going to oppose the development of the hydrogen bomb. He sees it as a weapon of genocide. He was kind of horrified at what had happened with the atomic bomb in Japan. Does not want this to happen, but it does. In 1952, the US is going to detonate its first hydrogen bomb at the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. And this is the site of SpongeBob today. And actually, if you look at explosions in SpongeBob episodes, they have the same mushroom cloud look that the hydrogen bomb explosion has, if you see pictures from that explosion at Bikini Atoll. So an interesting kind of pop culture reference to what's happening. So here is footage from primary source footage from when the hydrogen bomb was exploded on Bikini Atoll.
Once again, Bikini Atoll becomes the scene of the most dramatic nuclear explosion of all. For days, the target center and observation posts buzz with activity as weather planes circle the entire blast area, waiting for the most ideal conditions that will prevent disastrous radioactive fallout, the most difficult problem that must be solved in the Titanic blast. Wheels for the gigantic test are now in motion, and the seconds tick off. Far below the target island of Namu stands outlined with a cross of lights and its radar installation. Once again, weather planes make a last-minute check. A brilliance of 500 suns lights hundreds of miles of the Pacific, and the force of 1,000,000 tons of TNT is released. 15 seconds later, the light is still unbearable. Observers may well squint, for they may have witnessed a prelude to world destruction.
So the white dot is Panmunjom. The blue dot at the southernmost dot in South Korea is Busan. The black dot is Seoul. And that is an important popular city today. The yellow dot, which is up in North Korea on the North Korean border with China, that is Chusan. And then the pink dot, just to the west of Seoul, is Incheon. So those are going to be cities that we're going to be talking about as we go through this lecture on the Korean War. So let's talk first about the 38th parallel, and that is that white line that you see splitting North and South Korea. When Japan collapses in 1945, after the end of World War II, Soviet troops accepted the surrender of Japanese troops north of that line, while American troops accepted the surrender of Japanese troops south of that line. Now, North Korea and South Korea put together, the Korean Peninsula is roughly the size of Kentucky and Tennessee combined. So it's not that big of a country, but this dividing line is very important because you have the communists accepting a surrender to the north and a democracy accepting the surrender to the south. By 1949, Soviet and American troops had withdrawn from Korea, but the two hostile regimes in the north and the south are left still there, staring at each other over this 38th parallel line. So this kind of comes to a head on June 25th in 1950, when the North Korean army, driving Soviet-made tanks, crosses the 38th parallel and drove all the way to South Korea, all the way to the southern part of South Korea, and shot South Korean troops who are forced into a defensive area around Busan. Their backs are to the sea. They've been basically pushed way south. The invasion proved to the U.S. that it could not relax its guard against communism. We had to always be on guard for containment. And National Security Council Memorandum number 68, was issued that recommended that the U.S. quadruple defense spending to help with this policy of containment. Soon, the U.S. had 3.5 million men in its army and other branches of the armed forces, and we were spending $50 billion a year on defense. And that was a lot at that time period. That was a huge escalation of what we had been spending before. Truman takes advantage of a temporary Soviet absence from the UN Security Council to obtain a unanimous condemnation of North Korea as an aggressor. So the Soviets weren't able to veto it because they weren't there. The Security Council called upon all UN members to render assistance to restore peace between North and South Korea. Truman orders U.S. air and naval units to support South Korea. Douglas MacArthur's Japanese-based troops are put into action with the South Koreans. MacArthur was appointed the UN commander of the entire operation. And the picture that popped up is MacArthur with the South Korean President Syngman Rhee. On September 15th, 1950, MacArthur launched a daring amphibious landing behind enemy lines at Incheon, which is the pink dot. So the South Koreans were still forced further south and east, and so the North Koreans are there. Truman ordered MacArthur to continue pursuing the North Koreans who had been pushed back behind the 38th parallel. As long as there was no intervention by the Soviets or the Chinese, Truman was not interested in getting involved in fighting with China or the Soviet Union. By November of 1950, MacArthur had ventured near the Yalu River, very close to the Chinese border, and you can see that in the dotted line close to the Chinese border with North Korea. Tens of thousands of Chinese volunteers rushed into the fight, pushing the American and South Korean troops back down the peninsula, and there was a stalemate along the 38th parallel, that dividing line once again. MacArthur presses for a blockade of China and a bombing of their bases in Manchuria. He really wants to escalate this fight. He even suggested that the US could use nuclear weapons on the Chinese. Truman, the National Security Council, others in Washington disagree with him. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff called an escalation the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. This was not going to further our effort at containment, in the opinion of Washington. MacArthur very publicly criticizes the president's handling of the situation, so Truman removes him from command. And he's removed on April 11th, 1951. He was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway. This is a public relations nightmare for Truman. There's a stalemate. Peace talks drag on and off for nearly 2 years. So nothing is figured out. Truman is not popular for his decision, and nothing is really getting resolved. Eventually, the new dividing line is set, and that's where the current border between North and South Korea is. This is the demarcation line between the two countries. It's called the DMZ. It's a 2.5-mile wide, 160-mile long strip of land. It contains over 1 million landmines to prevent people from trying to go one way or the other. And the village of Panmunjom is right at the border. Now, Panmunjom, which is that white dot that you can see just south of the 38th parallel line, right on the border between North and South Korea. Originally, it's a small farming village just over the border in North Korea. It was the site of where the armistice was signed between the North and the South. Now it's an empty village. All the civilians around were removed just after the armistice. They were sent to other villages north and south. The only building that still stands in what was originally Panmunjom is what the North Koreans call the Peace Museum. Today, there is a village in South Korea just on the border called Panmunjom, and this is where the two countries meet today. And that is the picture that you see right to the very right of the slide. That's called the Truce Village. And we'll look at some pictures of it and talk some more about it in our next class. But the two countries met there as late as this January, so January 2018, last month. They met there not in original Panmunjom, but in the new Peace House on the South Korean side. And this is where they meet to kind of come to terms with each other. We're going to watch now a video from the James Bond movie, Die Another Day, where Bond is actually released at the demilitarized zone, the DMZ line, between North and South Korea. And it just gives you an idea of the security that's there and that kind of thing.
We reached the end, Mr. Bond. Spare me the unpleasantness. 50 years after the superpowers carved Korea into we were. A British spy, an assassin. And now the hardliners have their proof. You cannot trust the British. You took away my son. Your firing squad should have done the job for me. mistake. Let's get this over with, son. My son had an ally in the West. For the last time. Who was it? Who made him betray his country and his name? The same person who betrayed me. Turn around. Start walking. Tsar, I'm being traded. For you. Your time will come. Not as soon as yours. Look at him. You think he was some kind of a hero? All right, let's go.
No biological agents in the prelim scan. He's clean.
So you get the idea of the security that's there. There's a bridge there, and we'll talk about that bridge next class as well, where people from both sides were able to cross POWs after the armistice was signed. It's kind of a no man's land today. We'll talk about those things next class. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Make sure you've taken notes. If not, you can go back and write down anything you need to. There will be a quiz next class. I will see you then. Have a great day.